Good afternoon. Welcome to our webinar, and thank you for your interest of having signed up and join. Also, thank you for the opportunity to host this webinar and the opportunity to present some of the research we've done in our team in trial nutrition. Before I introduce myself and the team, some housekeeping information. You'll be able to see in the Teams environment an opportunity to ask questions, to type them, and we'll be able to address them at the end after the two presentations. And you'll also receive after the webinar some practical information that you may need, like the CPD QR code and the post-webinar information with the link to the video and details for further information. Now, about me and my team, I'm Javier Martín Tereso. I'm the manager of ruminant research in trial nutrition. We're a global R&D team, industry-based in our global nutrition company, Trial Nutrition, that operates across the continents in different aspects of ruminant nutrition. We do the central R&D to support this business, and we're a team of 8 researchers with a few PhD students located in various universities all over the world. We are located in the Netherlands, and we have 2 dedicated research facilities, one for dairy nutrition research and the other one for calf and beef nutrition research. We put a lot of emphasis on calf nutrition because we are a calf nutrition company. Our calf business is relatively large in our organization, but we also look very much into dairy and beef with focus on early life nutrition, with focus on health as affected by nutrition, and with focus on the process of efficiency in any ruminant animal. We deliver to the world about more than 15 peer-reviewed papers per year. We file patents through the years, and we serve the diversity of the business of our company. So from tropical cattle in Brazil for beef, tropical cattle in India for dairy, but with a strong emphasis with European dairy system, calf nutrition in the intensive dairy system, and also in North America for the most relevant ruminant nutrition production systems. Today, we'll have the opportunity to present the research done by my colleagues Jean-Baptiste Daniel and Juliette Wilms. They are 2 team members already for quite some years. Jean-Baptiste has been 12 years with us. He already did his PhD in a collaboration between Trial Nutrition and INRA in Paris, and he did his master's here in the Netherlands before. He's an author of multiple peer-reviewed papers. He is co-author of the reference book of INRA as part of his PhD, and he's invited all over the world for presentations in conferences, and has academic collaborations supervising PhD students in Wageningen and UC Davis. Juliette Wilms, another colleague of us, she's been 10 years with us. She did her PhD in Guelph, Canada, in a collaboration between Trial and the University of Guelph before she studied in Paris. Her focus has been on water and electrolyte balance in diarrhoeic calves. This is the topic of her presentation today, and she also works very much on the formulation of milk replacer for calves. She's got a long list of publications, a couple of patents. She speaks on conferences all over the world, and she also supervises PhD students in Munich and UC Davis in the US. Now, the 2 topics today are related to mineral nutrition, but also have plenty of things in common beyond it being related to minerals. In both cases, when it comes to calcium around calving and dehydration in diarrhoeic calves, it's all about the loss of homeostasis or homeostasis. And if you don't remember the definitions of these terms from back in school, while homeostasis is maintaining this state of equilibrium, homeostasis is very similar but this is trying to maintain a balance in a moving target. So it's like trying to be on the train, not fall of it or get back on it when you are off the train, because this equilibrium keeps on changing. It's a moving target. These two projects that you'll hear about today involved, of course, digging deep into the physiology, but also quantifying the losses and inputs of these nutrients. And also, it took to understand them as signals that have a counter reaction, a regulatory counter reaction by the animal. And to recover this balance in these animals, it took to not only define ways to restore the nutrient equilibrium, but also define interventions that are suitable for farm protocols, so that can be applied to any animal, not necessarily a sick animal, but that when applied to animals that are not necessarily sick, they don't cause additional problems. To illustrate this, when it comes to correcting calcium, of course, you're trying to maintain calcemia in the blood of a cow. If we overwhelm the supply of calcium, this may have a counter reaction that may cause problems. And this is even more of a problem with animals that do not have hypocalcemia to begin with. You'll hear more about this from Jean-Baptiste. In the case of calves, of course, they're losing sodium because they are diarrheic, but overwhelming the supply of sodium can impede the recovery of the acid-base balance. And Juliette will explain more about this. So in essence, what we're trying to do here is to restore the balance in critical moments. And with that, I would like to give the floor to my colleague Jean-Baptiste for his presentation.
Thank you, Javier, for the introduction, and welcome everybody for this symposium. So as Javier mentioned, I'm going to focus on the period of the transition and give a special emphasis on the calcium. We all know that milk fever in particular is of concern, and hypocalcemia or subclinical hypocalcemia, and this relationship to disease has been a long-term challenge. So I'm going to give you a bit of an insight in first how calcium is regulated by the animal, and what is the problems around transition, and what can we do then to mitigate the risk of milk fever. So hypocalcemia happen around transition, and particularly at calving, because typically the need for exporting calcium from the to gestation, to support gestation, increase during lactation. So if the cow evolutionary has one calf and milk production is only there to support the milk allowance of this single cow, the shift in calcium need from gestation to lactation is relatively moderate. But nowadays, when we select cows for milk productivity for human consumption, this cow is not only making milk for one calf, but making milk for several calves, which naturally creates a clear discontinuity in the calcium clearance from the blood to support colostrogenesis and to support further milk productivity. So just as an example, roughly speaking, although this is an average, calcium demand increased from 80 to about 500 milligram per kilo body size, metabolic body size. So this additional demand, the cow has to basically be able to support by either getting enough calcium from the diet or getting enough calcium from the internal resources. And it has been very well described that some cows challenge to do that. And we can see, for example, on the left side graph, that plasma calcium is challenged around parturition for all cows. And most of the cows actually decrease calcium and then recover quickly. But some cows have really troubles to maintain this hypocalcemia, and calcium go down to a very critical level, which induce milk fever and all the negative consequences associated with it. So why is the cow challenged? Why is this mechanism not able to cope with this sudden demand? And we need to look a little bit on how calcium homeostasis is regulated. So just to simplify pictures of how metabolically calcium is regulated, ionized blood calcium is really the target in blood, and the thyroid gland is very sensitive to the levels of ionized blood calcium. So it will sense this level and secrete an hormone which is called PTH. And PTH will have two main functions. One is to signal the kidney to keep calcium inside the body, although there is very limited losses in ruminant to lose calcium, and we will discuss a little bit more about it after. But the other one is also to activate the last enzymatic step of the vitamin D, so to get to calcitriol, the active form of vitamin D, which can both help to stimulate calcium resorption from the bone, but also help to stimulate calcium absorption from the gut. So PTH can also act directly in the bone, and depending on the signal, can favor accretion or resorption. Now, if we look at it, these two main streams to get calcium into the blood from the bone or from the gut are supporting calcium homeostasis at different time frames. So calcium absorption efficiency, we will see, is really supporting the long-term control of calcium homeostasis. So making sure the calcemia is going to be controlled by adapting to the right efficiency depending on calcium stature. While bone, if there is a sudden decrease in calcium, can be a very big player to maintain calcemia because it can readily supply calcium. But we'll see also that some cows struggle with this ability to withdraw enough calcium at the right speed. So this is a simplified version of the metabolic control of calcium. It's a principle that applies to many mammals. But let's look a little bit of the implication of changing calcium and look at the impact of homeostasis at the animal level. This is a very elegant study, quite old, I must admit, but which reflects very nicely what this homeostatic control results in terms of calcium retention. So this is a study where basically those sheep were kept in metabolic crates so that we could collect feces and urine every single week. And you can see the duration of the study was quite long, 36 weeks. The first 12 weeks of the study, those sheep were kept on what we would consider a normal calcium supply to support their basic maintenance, which supply 105 milligrams per day of calcium per kilo body mass. And then the calcium level was suddenly increased, and you can see how calcium retention changed over time. And what is quite remarkable is that you can see that calcium retention initially increased, and the first 2-3 weeks is really superior to what we found with a normal intake. And then again, when we keep those sheep after 12 weeks and we change them back to the normal intake, they go into what we would call a negative calcium balance. So they are withdrawing calcium from the body, and before they return to the original calcium retention that we observed in the first period. So how was that achieved? First, we can see that there is a good balance between bone calcium accretion and calcium resorption, and the equilibrium basically was met during the normal intake period at 53.7. This is a number at week 8. So, and calcium accretion was identical. So that means that calcium basically is not accumulating, neither resorbed from the bone. But then what happened when we looked at 2 weeks after adapting to a high calcium intake, calcium resorption decreased. So this was basically indicating that calcium in the bone was higher because they were losing less calcium to adapt to that sudden change in calcium. Then it finally went back to 53, a value close to what we observed during the normal intake after 8 weeks when those researchers looked at it. Then again, when they changed them to a normal intake, they had a higher calcium resorption, so supporting the observation that calcium balance was negative to finally go back here. So this shows the critical role of the bone, even within 2 weeks time period, to support calcium homeostasis. And interestingly, because in this study, they also looked at the absorption efficiency, true absorption efficiency of calcium, you can see that initially after 2 weeks, calcium absorption efficiency was actually identical to the normal intake. So this indicates that the gut was not yet adapted to the high calcium diet, but 8 weeks later, this calcium efficiency was going down because, of course, those sheep cannot accumulate calcium in the bone indefinitely, but then they regulate absorption efficiency to be able to sustain normal calcemia with this particular diet. And the same observation were seen when they went back to normal intake. So you can see and appreciate the different adaptation timing between the mobilization of calcium from the bone and adaptation in the gut. So the strategy we have today to help to support the calcemia around calving, they are twofold, mainly a prepartum dietary strategy, which has been very effective at preventing milk fever in most cases. And this strategy mostly relies on priming the cow to respond efficiently to a sudden change in calcium status. So priming the cow to be able to upregulate calcium absorption, but also to upregulate the ability to mobilize calcium from the bone. And the strategy which supports this has been the use of anionic salt, and I'm going to talk about it in my next slide. The use of low dietary calcium diet, it may be challenging, but it has been shown to be possible. The use of zeolites, which initially were thought to mainly bound calcium, but now there is more and more evidence that actually it affects phosphorus, because low phosphorus diet is also a strategy that seems to be effective to prevent milk fever. Vitamin D supplementation has been shown also always, but its application may be difficult. The second type of intervention we see is to, once cows have been primed or not, and calving kicks in and this need of calcium goes up, is to supply additional calcium at a critical time in the form of a boluses, in the form of infusion, in the form of drinks. Various strategy has been proposed, and we will discuss the pros and cons of those strategy. So just briefly to indicate, one of the most popular strategy to prevent milk fever is the use of anionic salt. And this study, again, from the same author I showed before, is an elegant demonstration of the mechanism of anionic salt. Because anionic salt mainly acidifies metabolically the animal, so it lowers the pH. And this is translated here in lowering also of urinary pH. And this metabolic acidity basically challenges the functionality of a key player in calcium homeostasis in a kidney. And this is a transporter which basically make sure that the calcium is being kept in the body but not excreted in urine. This transporter is very efficient in ruminant because ruminants are very good at conserving calcium, but its functionality is impaired by acidosis. So if we adapt a cow to an acidotic diet prior to calving, basically we impair the functionality and calcium goes into urine at a greater level. And this is the example of a study where ammonium chloride was added in the diet of a sheep. And immediately you see that urine calcium increased by about 17 milligrams per day per kilo body size. And those researchers also quantifies to isotope the true absorption, so what absolute amount was increased in the gut, and they actually found that the very similar amount of calcium was absorbed from the gut to support basically the additional requirement, fictive requirement, basically of exporting calcium into urine. And in this way, absorption efficiency is already upregulated and is better prepared to cope with the sudden calcium demand. In that study, bone was not affected, so this shows that the gut was the main player to support that. However, anionic salts have some defaults. They are not perfect. Cattle have evolved to eat a high decad diet, and this was an elegant demonstration that when actually anionic salt was applied on a single dry cow diet, so on an extended period of time for 42 days instead of the classic close-up period of 21 days, oftentimes to simplify the management of dry cow period diet, actually less cows were getting pregnant for those that had received a negative decad for an extended period of time. And of course, bringing a lot of chloride has negative implication on VFA absorption and metabolic acidosis. So this is not something actually which is physiologically, which cows are physiologically adapted. So we should also always keep in mind to not abuse of this practice on an extended period of time. In this study, also the first 40 days, milk yield was negatively impacted for those cows that had received a negative decad diet for 42 days. So the other priming of applying oftentimes a low calcium diet of upregulating those absorption efficiency, but the capacity of calcium to get into the blood is exemplified here with a challenge, a sudden challenge of bringing ADTA, a strong chelator, into the blood. And this chelator basically bound, among others, to calcium. And after 4 hours of infusion, you can see that basically the initial serum calcium, which is illustrated on the left plot, where initially it was stand at 110 milligrams per liter for both treatment. When you infuse ADTA, then calcium immediately go down. So this challenged hypocalcemia. But if those sheep were previously adapted to a lower calcium diet compared to a normal calcium diet, you can see that the total amount of calcium that they were able to keep in serum was much larger, and they were an absolute amount of 40 milligrams for those fed the low calcium diet. And this was mainly supported by an additional mobilization of calcium from bone, indicated that those sheep were more sensitive and more able to respond quickly to this 4 hour ADTA infusion and providing this calcium to the blood. So this is an additional advantage of priming cow to support hypocalcemia in early part of the lactation. Now, if we looked at some trajectory and some interesting observation recently in the literature, we see different kind of pattern between cows in the way calcium change after parturition. Some cows, basically in grays, they are very able to have minimal drop in total calcium and generally do well. Some cows drop very quickly, but then are able to rebound very quickly too. But others have a kind of a delay hypocalcemia. And interestingly, there is different association in terms of performance between those trajectory. When those cows were able to rebound very quickly, still dropped at 1 day, but rebound very quickly, those cows were actually the highest productive cow, which show actually that those cows may be quite sensitive to upregulate calcium homeostasis, but this drop may simply be a challenge to high production, but not necessarily a negative impact, because there were limited evidence that health was an issue on those animals. However, those cows that had a delay hypocalcemia, that after 4 or 5 days still show total calcium value around 2, those had a much higher risk of adverse effect of getting pregnant or any kind of health disorder associated to it. So this is interesting because recently we've been able to highlight more and more that what we see after parturition is not necessarily always the consequences of calcium disbalance from the nutritional perspective. But it may also be that other aspects such as inflammation play a role. This is illustrated here, where once we infuse an LPS, so it will activate the immune system to respond, and you can see that it has a profound impact on the total serum calcium you see. So this is a control group maintaining calcemia, and well, actually this control group were had a IV. Sorry, so they had an IV. So this is not a purely control, but the control group dropped and showing the impact of the inflammation. And interestingly, when we looked at association, we see that cows which are classified as eucalcemic, so that maintain calcium at 4 days in milk above 2.3, versus those that are dyscalcemic, classified as below 2.2. There were strong differences, and this again is association in a pattern of inflammation between this group of cows. So this is something to always keep in mind, that the calcemia may not always be a nutritional challenge because of the inadequate calcium management, but may also be the consequences of any kind of immune activation and challenges around transition. So what can we do once we have managed to prime the cow to upregulate calcium? What can we do post-calving to help those cows to support health and a good start of a lactation? So in line with this type of LPS infusion, some first hypothesis has been to propose to initially avoid this drop by feeding additional source of calcium. And there is some evidence in the literature with the use of oral calcium that show potential benefit of this practice, as they were those authors with a group of Ohio State from Lance Baumgard supporting better management of calcemia when oral calcium was made available after an LPS infusion. But equally, there is also negative impact of other practice, which are a little bit more aggressive, which actually bring calcium as an IV into the blood in order to maintain a calcemia. And those cows that receive the IV were actually had an impaired milk yield during and after the LPS infusion. So this we should be careful because the way we bring the calcium may disrupt the natural homeostasis and signaling of that the cow use. We have to be careful with an IV. And I'm going to show you why further reason to be careful with IV. Typically, there's now a few studies that show the behaviors after we apply an IV and showing what's happened in the blood of those cows. And there is a control of cows that did not receive any intervention with calcium. There is a group of cows receiving an IV, and you see immediately that the calcium in blood goes up, secondly, but then slowly bounce back. And after actually 20 hours, one day later, the calcemia was actually lower than the control. So this may be actually a signal which can be dangerous if it's especially applied prophylactically across cows, where the signals is that calcium homeostasis seems actually to be positive, shutting down the absorption and the adaptation the cow need to take. In contrast, you see that when calcium is provided orally, it sustains a much more stable and continuous application of calcium. So this was applied in this specific case as 2 boluses, 12 hours apart. And we will see that there is also differences between the way we can apply calcium orally. There is an importance in source, and initially it was believed that sources which are highly soluble, like calcium chloride or calcium sulfate, were the one that we should be feeding because of their greater availability to support maintaining the calcemia in blood. Unfortunately, those sources are not very palatable, so the solution to feed those calcium is to force fed through boluses. The disadvantages of calcium chloride, whether it is voluntarily consumed or force-fed, is that they also create some irritation in the gut lining, which can damage epithelial function. They are quickly absorbed, and so it's interesting to look at what happened in terms of calcium homeostasis, and we will look at a study we did to compare different applications of calcium. Calcium carbonate, in other hand, is palatable, so that's a strong advantage because it can be fed and voluntarily consumed. It was initially believed because of its low solubility in the rumen that it will have a poor availability, but a lot of studies have completely challenged this view and show that calcium carbonate can be actually very available. And the advantage is that the availability is more prolonged because its supply is determined by its passage rate out of the rumen, so that slowly this calcium carbonate will diffuse and may be made available in the small intestine. So this was a study we did some years ago with my colleague Juliette, who will spoke about the electrolyte application in calf later after me. And you see in that specific study with dairy cows that after calving, we had three treatment groups. So a control, untreated group, and two groups of cows, one receiving a calcium drink, 45 grams of calcium, one application after calving, containing mostly calcium carbonate. And we had another treatment group with calcium boluses. And this time we did not follow the application of the manufacturer, but we only fed one application after calving to provide an identical amount of calcium, mostly in the form of calcium chloride and a bit of calcium sulfate. And you can see that when there is one application with a dotted line, that there is a similar behavior as the IV for calcium infusion, but actually it bounces a little bit back. So you see that initially it goes up above control, but goes down to even slightly numerically below what the control show. In contrast, when we supply the same amount of calcium and it's voluntarily consumed by the cow, this calcium carbonate supports a better calcium homeostasis. Interestingly, when we try to analyze across study the implication on subsequent lactation, calcium boluses have not been able to demonstrate a benefit in terms of improving milk yield or pregnancy. So they are not a nutritional practice which are recommended widespread as a prophylactic strategy, but mostly recommended for targeting specific animal. And it's still unclear of the benefit. And it could be in part because of the nature of the way this calcium is fed through a bolus, and also the type of calcium that we provide. We have been able to conduct a study, a randomized control study across 10 farms. So each farm, we enroll a total of 500 cows. Cows were randomly assigned to either within farm to the control or the calcium oral drink that contained calcium carbonate. And an advantage, an interesting response is that most cows consume the full product. So 80% consume the full product within a short period of time, which is 20 liters. And we also saw some actually significant benefit in terms of productivity in the next lactation. So 1.5 kilo more milk in the next lactation for primiparous cows. We saw numerical changes in the odd to reach the next lactation, but this was not significant, and this will require a lot more number to be able to confirm. Finally, another advantage of providing calcium in the form of a drink is a fluid that the cow can consume. When we control the time that it takes for the cow to drink 20 liters of water, we can see that only the treatment that provided oral calcium as a form of calcium carbonate here had such a fast drink compared to the two alternative treatments that provided calcium either as a bolus or the negative control with water. So with that, I would like to wrap up and discuss some few take-home message. I think we need really to understand that we should not aim to manipulate calcium homeostasis, but mostly support it by priming the cow in a dry period to upregulate calcium homeostasis. And unique diets are really effective, but require careful management. Adequately low dietary calcium supply can be achieved to stimulate the adaptation upon choices of forages in some cases. And lower dietary P may sometimes also be a more promising strategy to when low dietary calcium is not an option. Whereas I haven't talked about it, but vitamin D manipulation carries risk because of the importance, the critical importance of the timing of the application. And for post-calving calcium supply, the use of IV should only really be restricted to correcting an acute hypocalcemia in a life-threatening situation, but not as a standard application across cows. Soluble oral calcium boluses are effective to maintain calcium homeostasis, but they are only effective when we because we require multiple application, and they may cause irritation because of the application, but also because of the source of calcium mostly in the GIT. So a single voluntary oral calcium carbonate application is equally effective to support and may actually enhance milk performance. At least this is what we've been able to see. So with that, if you also have some more questions, we have some people in our company that can help you to figure out what nutritional solution we can provide. And I'm going to give the floor to my colleague, Juliette, for the rest of this technical webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the transition. So I'm Juliette Wilms. My presentation today will be about the nutritional strategies to support the recovery of diarrheic calves. But first, I wanted us to reflect on what are the main pathogens that are involved in calf diarrhea. And I know that as veterinarians, many of you are more familiar with this. But most of the research on electrolyte composition has focused on E. coli model in calves, while actually calves mostly suffer from rotavirus and Cryptosporidium parvum, which account for about 50% of all diarrhea cases. We should also really make the distinction because between what is preventive. So if you want to prevent diarrhea in calves, of course, there is the housing management, the hygiene, and a lot of those factors. But there is also the dry period vaccination of the dairy cow against E. coli, rotavirus, coronavirus, and now against Cryptosporidium to be fed via the colostrum to the calves. The colostrum management is probably also one of the most important actions that can be taken. And it's important to have high quality nutrition for calves, so high quality whole milk or milk replacer if you want to effectively prevent diarrhea. When calves do get sick, we can support the recovery by, for example, increasing the feeding frequency and reducing the meal size, but I would never change the milk allowance of those calves. We can use oral rehydration solutions and intravenous solutions when they are really down. And on this slide, I really want to emphasize that oral rehydration solutions should be provided to calves that already have diarrhea and will not prevent the diarrhea. And the use of antibiotics must be responsible. And at last, providing ad libitum access to water is extremely important. And we know that producers usually do not provide water in the first 2 weeks of the life of a calf. And this is exactly when diarrhea is the most prevalent. So if we look into the physiology of diarrhea, it can be depending on the different nutritional factors or the different pathogens. And we know that one calf can be affected by several pathogens. Diarrhea can arise because of an increase of secretions. For example, in the case of E. coli, and in humans, in the case of cholera, we will have extensive secretions, active secretions from the blood to the lumen of the gut because of the action of the toxins. We can also have a lower absorption. We know that, for example, Cryptosporidium will damage the gut mucosa, and we can see it on those photos. Which will prevent the absorption, and that itself can also lead to wet feces in calves. There can also be an altered intestinal motility, and because of the increased secretions and the lower absorption, there can also be an increased luminal osmolality that will further pull water out of the blood, leading to diarrhea in calves. When oral electrolyte solutions were developed in human medicine, this was based on a good understanding on what were the electrolyte and the fecal losses in diarrheic calves during total collection. In diarrheic children with total collection, but in calves, if you want to find data on total collection of urine and feces of sick calves, we need to go back to 1972. And what we see is that healthy calves will have a fecal dry matter of about 30%. And when they are close to death, it will fall down around 6% dry matter. And that goes together with a drastic increase in the fecal output and in the sodium concentration in the feces. And in the urine, we see the opposite. The urine volume will fall and the sodium concentration in the urine will also fall because the animal will try to retain water and sodium to prevent severe dehydration. And why is sodium so important? Because it is known as the skeleton of the extracellular fluid in the body, which are more important in newborn animals, and the extracellular fluids can be lost easily. And here I'm showing you the example of a very diarrheic calf that we had in our facility. So this animal was not getting electrolytes, neither intravenous solution, And we see that the sodium intake via the milk replacer was less than 2 grams per day because this animal wasn't drinking much. That animal was losing almost no sodium through the urine, and through the feces, we see that in 24 hours, this animal was losing more than about 4 times the sodium that was ingested, and the difference between the intake of sodium and the output in urine and feces is actually causing a negative sodium balance. And because the sodium is maintaining the extracellular fluid in the body, such a drastic loss will lead to severe dehydration. Diarrheic calves also go through metabolic disturbances, and this is just a simplification of what is happening, but we can make 2 easy categories, either malabsorptive diarrhea, which is what is the most prevalent, for example, rotavirus, cryptosporidium, coronavirus, and secretory diarrhea, which take into account, for example, E. coli. Both diarrhea can lead to dehydration because of what I have just shown. In the case of malabsorptive diarrhea, we will also have intestinal bacterial fermentation of unabsorbed nutrients, for example, the lactose in whole milk or in milk replacer, and that can lead to an accumulation of D-lactate in the blood, and it has been shown that this is the worst outcome in terms of acidosis for a diarrheic calf, and this is mostly seen in calves that are a bit older, 2 to 3 weeks of age, because those animals have mostly diarrhea by malabsorption. Because of the dehydration, there will be a lower perfusion of the tissue. There will be an anaerobic metabolism and an accumulation of L-lactate. Because of the fecal losses, the animals are going to lose electrolytes. Their kidney will not be able to excrete efficiently the protons, and that leads to different types of metabolic acidosis. If it's driven by lactate accumulation, it's much worse for the animal than if it is due to differences in strong anions and cations. But those animals getting metabolic acidosis, eventually that can become toxic and they can die. And we have seen that in calves of 2 to 3 weeks of age, having diarrhea, about 60% of them will develop some degree of metabolic acidosis. Of course, the severity of the metabolic acidosis also depends what type of metabolic acidosis it is. So now let's move to the composition of those oral rehydration solutions and the current recommendations. So those products that we are giving to calves, they should contain sodium because we want to restore the severe losses of sodium in the feces, and we want to restore and maintain the extracellular fluid volume in the body of those young calves. They do have a negative energy balance because of the lower absorption and because of the anorexia, but originally the glucose was intended to enhance the absorption of water and sodium in oral rehydration solutions developed for humans. And there is a ratio between the glucose and the sodium, so we should not provide one in excess of the other. And at last, the last point is mostly relevant for calves and for small ruminants because they are prone to severe metabolic acidosis, and it seems not to be the case in humans or in piglets, for example. So for calves, we really need to have a high strong ion difference, which is the difference of the concentration between sodium plus potassium minus the chloride concentrations. And this will allow to correct the electrolyte imbalances in the blood of sodium, potassium, and chloride, and it will increase the blood pH, and any product that have an SID below 60 milliequivalent per liter is not suitable for diarrheic calves. I think that there are European regulation on that point, but I don't know to what extent this is actually enforced. And usually when I see products that are made for piglets and for calves, I worry a little bit because products with a really high SID are also not good for piglet because then it will increase the blood pH way too much. So this is just a small chart to represent the fecal sodium losses in relation to the diarrhea etiology in children, because those data do not yet exist in calves, although some universities are interested to also generate this. So in healthy children and adults, there's almost no sodium that is lost through the feces. Usually the sodium is regulated via the kidney. So we can, if we eat something that's very salty, it's going to be, the excess will be excreted in the urine. But when we have children with rotavirus, they lose about 60 milligram per kilogram body weight per day. When it's E. coli, we see that it's double. And then we understand better why a calf with E. coli can get dehydrated in a few hours, much faster than when they have rotavirus or cryptosporidium. And that's why they are so hard to save sometimes. And when we look at cholera, we see that it's even much more extreme than E. coli, and cholera can actually kill an adult. While with other types of diarrhea, it's very hard to kill an adult because our water is much more difficult to lose because it's mostly intracellular. What's interesting is that in human medicine, there has been extensive research, many published experiments on hundreds of children with total collection. They determined that the right sodium concentration in an oral rehydration solution for patients suffering from cholera was 75 millimole per liter. Yet in calves, we are recommending much higher concentration between 90 to 130 millimole per liter of sodium. But calves do not get cholera and they rarely get E. coli. That was my first slide of this presentation. We have about 5% of calves that will suffer from E. coli. And we know that with E. coli, when there are big problems on farm, we should go back to the colostrum management because these are diarrheas that are very difficult to handle just with oral rehydration solutions in very young calves. So I presented on this graph the recommendations from the WHO for oral rehydration solutions for humans. And we clearly see that in terms of glucose, it should be 75 millimole per liter, same for the sodium. But in calves, we recommend much, much higher concentration. And why is the glucose so high in electrolyte for calves? It's because in the past, we used to recommend to cut the milk. So the only fluid and the only source of energy the calf would get was through the electrolyte solution. And that's why we have tried to push a lot of energy in those solutions. But actually, even 300 millimole per liter of glucose in an electrolyte will provide very little energy to the calf as compared to what they would get with milk. So I really prefer to, if we are really worried, to increase the feeding frequency and reduce the meal size rather than cutting the milk and relying on electrolyte, because actually all the research is showing that this is not the right way to move forward with sick calves. And as a consequence of this high sodium and high glucose, we have very hypertonic solutions for calves, while in humans, it has been shown in many studies, in rat models, in humans, also in young children, that the best osmolality is around 245 milliosmol per kilogram for an optimal rehydration. The only thing I agree with is the fact that for calves, we need a high SID, which is not so crucial for humans because they do not get such severe metabolic acidosis issues. And the problem with very hypertonic electrolyte is that they can actually stimulate the diarrhea because the diarrheic child or calf will not be able to absorb all the solutes in the solution because there is an effective range in terms of concentration that can be absorbed by the body. And if we cross that range, part is not absorbed, and because those solutes, glucose, sodium, chloride, are osmotically active, they will draw water together with it, so we see an increase in the diarrhea. So it's not what we want. So we wanted to test this hypothesis to benchmark the rules for electrolyte formulations from the human medicine to that of veterinary medicine for calves. So we got calves that were diarrheic in a collection center in Germany. We selected them to have a dehydration, to have signs of dehydration and metabolic acidosis. We were measuring the blood-based excess. And we also wanted those calves to be able to walk and drink by themselves because the IV point was out of the scope of our study. And we were recruiting 18 calves per batch, 12 calves per week for a total of 72 calves for the experiment. And we had 18 animals per treatment group. So we designed 3 treatment groups, with one electrolyte being hypotonic, having lactose, following the recommendations from the WHO. Then we had an electrolyte that was isotonic. This one had glucose, so it was a little bit, it had an osmolality that was slightly higher. And at last, we had a hypertonic treatment that was really matching with the veterinary recommendations for oral rehydration solutions for diarrheic calves. But we didn't go to the extreme because the extreme of the recommendation is 600 milliosmol per kilogram, but we thought that this would be too much. So we went up to 470, and we made sure that the SID of those 3 electrolytes would be the same. Because a problem in literature for calves is that there are papers comparing hypertonic to hypotonic, but usually it's hypotonic low SID against hypertonic high SID. So the hypertonic electrolyte always works better because the SID is high, and that's what they need because they get metabolic acidosis. So it's very important to have hypotonic electrolyte with a high SID as well. And then we had a placebo treatment. So we had one group of calves that did not receive electrolytes, because we also wanted to show superiority against water. And those calves were getting 5 grams per liter of whey powder in the water. So if we just look at the composition of those treatments, you can see that there's much more glucose in the hypertonic treatment, much more sodium. So in the hypotonic and isotonic treatment, we had about 80 millimole per liter of sodium. We had 130 in the hypertonic treatment, and the chloride was also higher. The propionate and the SID were the same, and the osmolality was 260 in the hypotonic treatment and 470 in the hypertonic electrolytes. When we got those calves in our facility, almost all of them developed diarrhea on the day after arrival. We took a blood sample every day in the morning. We collected urine for 3 days and feces for 24 hours. There's no other paper reporting total collection of feces and urine in diarrheic calves. And then we fed the electrolyte in between milk meal at noon and at 9 in the evening. So if we look at intakes of the plain water, because those calves also had access to water, of the treatment, which are the electrolyte, and on Milkoplacer, those calves are not drinking much because they had been in transit in Germany for about 2 to 3 days. So they were really like severely challenged for more reason than just the diarrhea. So they could barely drink more than 4.5 liters per day. And you can see clearly here that they liked better the electrolytes. So they were drinking the same volume of electrolyte regardless of the tonicity, and they did not like the control, which was just warm water with the placebo. If we look at the serum sodium, so typically when calves are getting very dehydrated and when they have severe diarrhea, we'll see a drop in the serum sodium, which is usually accompanied with dehydration. Here we see that the sodium was maintained effectively the same way in the 3 electrolyte group, hypotonic, isotonic, and hypertonic. What was interesting was the sodium balance. So we did the input, so the ingestion through the Milkoplacer and the electrolyte minus the output in the urine and the feces. So we get the sodium balance, and we see that the balance, what's retained in the body of those calves in the first 24 hours, was the same between the 3 electrolytes, which is strange because the hypertonic treatment was providing much more sodium than the hypotonic and isotonic treatment. So where is this sodium going? This was the most surprising result from our study. Now we see how it makes sense, but it's something that is actually not really known. So you can clearly see here that the blood pH and the blood base excess. So the blood base excess is a really nice parameter when we are evaluating metabolic acidosis severity in diarrheic calves. It is showing the amount of base or acid needed in the blood to normalize the blood pH level. And you can see that the only 2 electrolytes that are significantly different from the control, which was warm water with that little bit of whey, are the electrolytes following the recommendations from the WHO for sodium concentration. And it's not something that could be expected because the SID of the 3 treatments was the same, and the intake per day over the 3 days in which we provided electrolyte was also the same. So why would the hypertonic treatment not be different statistically from the control? We see that numerically it's better, but it's not statistical. We had the answer in the total collection of feces. So you can clearly see here that the fecal sodium is higher in calves getting the hypertonic electrolyte. And this very well aligned with all the work in human medicine. When sodium concentration is too high, but also when glucose concentration is too high, part of the sodium and probably the glucose cannot be absorbed by the calf or by the child. And it's just coming out directly in the feces. And this will also pull water together with it. And that's why we see that those calves fed the hypertonic electrolyte, they also lose more water in the feces. So this means that in the case of the hypotonic and the isotonic treatment, all the sodium is absorbed, but not in the case of the hypertonic treatments. So the SID that we think we have, the SID that we formulated, is not the same as the effective SID in the calf, because in the calf, part of the sodium is not absorbed. So actually here we were targeting an SID of 75 milliequivalent per liter. Maybe it was only 50, because all this part of sodium was not absorbed, but all the chloride is coming in. We also had signs of improved hydration. We saw that the hypertonic treatment was also challenging the calves for the urine osmolality, because they had to get rid of that excess chloride and sodium that was absorbed, and that caused the rise in the urine osmolality. And in a diarrheic calf, we want the opposite. And when we look at the changes in plasma volume, we see that the expansion was better with the hypotonic treatment, which is also consistent with what's described in human medicine. So what happens, this is unpublished data, but I just wanted to quickly mention that what happens when an electrolyte is too high in dextrose and sodium. We've seen in our study that it doesn't work very well. It actually lowers the fecal dry matter, so the calves have more diarrhea because they don't absorb something that's osmotically active. And if you really go in the extreme in the sugar, if you go, let's say 180, 200 millimole per liter in your electrolyte, you can actually acidify the blood of the calf, because those sugar can be used by the pathogen and cause probably can worsen the accumulation of lactate in blood. So I would be very careful with the concentration of sodium and sugar. So what are the best practices for administration of oral rehydration solutions? We should really start with a calf that has diarrhea, because I've seen farms feeding it after birth, feeding it for the first 2 weeks of life. It's just sugar and salt at the end of the day, and it has a strong effect on the blood pH. So we don't want to give this to a healthy calf. We need to see a drop in fecal dry matter before we start to initiate the treatment, and I would recommend to keep feeding milk, because it has been shown in many papers that when we sustain milk during diarrhea, calves recover faster and they are also heavier. The electrolyte should be provided in between milk meals, and I would always keep the usual milk feeding scheme that's already in place. If a farmer has time, they can reduce the meal size, provide more meals through the day, but I know that this is very challenging in terms of labor. And when the electrolytes are initiated, it should be fed or provided to the calf for at least 3 days. Because if we feed it the first day and then we stop, it's possible that the state of the calf will deteriorate, because they can still go down into metabolic acidosis and dehydration if the diarrhea has not stopped. Something that should be completely prohibited is to mix electrolyte directly into whole milk, and especially not in milk replacers, because the final solution will have an osmolality that can reach 600 milliosmol per kilogram. It's double the osmolality of whole milk. And that can cause osmotic diarrhea, and it will cause osmotic diarrhea. It can cause hypernatremia, salt poisoning, if calves have no access to plain water. And we know that's the case on many farms. It can also cause abomasal bloating. And after this webinar, we are going to share some scientific papers, and one is talking about that specifically. And it's very also, it's bad for the overall gut integrity because it's too hypertonic. So definitely not something that we should do. And we also are going to share a paper on hypernatremia. So these were calves getting electrolytes into their milk replacer, and they had no access to water. And you can see that hypernatremia is building up very rapidly. So it can actually happen within 24 to 48 hours. And then we have to be very careful to recognize the signs of hypernatremia, because it looks like severe diarrhea. And the only way to correct this is by providing water slowly. So the conclusion of my presentation, we have seen that the composition and the administration protocols of oral rehydration solutions present wide variations. So there are actually many products on the market that still recommend to mix in milk. Usually, when I read this, I immediately conclude that that company does not really know what they are doing. This is a very dangerous practice. And if we carefully read the literature on that topic, we see that even in those papers, they show that actually the efficacy is much higher when it's mixed in water, and we are taking a risk, especially with bloating, when we are mixing it together. So those practices can actually really compromise the efficacy and the safety of the treatment of diarrheic calf. We completely align with the current literature regarding the alkalinizing capacity. It needs to be higher than 60 milliequivalent per liter. But the current conventions for sodium and for osmolality, and therefore also for glucose, are way too high for calves. And there is a need to lower those concentration. And we currently have a patented formula, or it's patent pending, where we show how important it is to have the right balance between the SID and the osmolality. And when that's right, we can have a really effective recovery of diarrheic calf.
Thank you, Juliette, for the presentation, also to Jean-Baptiste. Comes now time for questions. I have a few of them, but I'm going to give priority to those coming in. I have a question from Aaron Park. Don't forget to fill the poll that just popped into your screen. I'm going to read this first question. What impact do you feel including a butyric acid product during this hydration time of the calf would have upon health? And this is a question for Juliette, of course.
I think butyric acid is extremely interesting, but I think that the real opportunity is to feed it every day through the milk replacer to improve gut health. I think what diarrheic calves really need is that we tackle the metabolic acidosis and the hydration to save their life.
Okay. Just for everyone to know, there is a Q&A button on the top left corner of your screen. While we wait for more questions, I'm going to ask a question myself to Jean-Baptiste, a very simple one, but I think a very important one. What would be your ideal pre-calving protocol when it comes to preventing hypocalcemia when you apply that protocol to all cows in the herd, including heifers?
Yes, depending on the availability of forages and the natural native content of calcium, I will use anionic salt as a second option. So if I can avoid anionic salt, I will probably do. And we've seen the successful application of the combination of straw, soybean meal, and maize silage. So this together can often do a great prepartum diet and still stimulate sufficiently upregulation of calcium in 2 means, because first it's ingredients which are typically lower in calcium, but also adding sufficient amount of straw prevent overconsumption of the total dry matter intake, which prevents excessive calcium supply. So I think that will be my preferred strategy when possible. And this supporting further, because we see especially to older cows that maintaining calcium homeostasis can be challenging. So I do believe that providing additional calcium supply after calving can be positive. And preferentially, I like the cow to drink it voluntarily.
Okay. Another question for Jean-Baptiste. Dr. Daniel, why do you say that calcium chloride boluses need a second application while calcium carbonate would not?
So this is related in the solubility of the calcium source. So when you feed a certain amount of same amount of calcium chloride versus calcium carbonate, if it's in the form of calcium chloride, then it's very soluble in the rumen and will be quickly absorbed into the blood and create this peak, which actually will give a signal of excess calcium, which might actually downplay the upregulation and result in a moderate lower hypocalcemia a few hours later. So in order to avoid this dip, the supplier of this type of product recommend a second application, which allow to maintain calcemia in these critical windows of time. While with calcium carbonate, this is less soluble in the rumen, and the supply to the animal will mostly be relying on passage rate of the liquid out of the rumen into the small intestine. So this passage rate for liquid, we know it's about 8 to 10%. So this means that there is potentially 8 to 10% liquid carrying that calcium carbonate, leaving the rumen and accessing the small intestine. So this will be gradually available, and once it reaches the small intestine, it will be available to the animal to absorb. And so this is why we see that for the same application of an amount of calcium carbonate is better able to maintain calcemia over a longer period of time.
Okay. I have another one that Juliet is going to like. What kind of electrolyte should we feed when we receive calves into our farm? I guess this is more of a veal, dairy beef type of question.
So in the case of transported calves, I think that the work of David Renaud in the University of Guelph is nicely showing that what is making those calves, what is really increasing the morbidity is the length of the feed deprivation. So when those calves arrive, we want them to go quickly on milk to not extend that feed deprivation period. So I would not recommend electrolyte for those calves, or at least not as a first meal, or maybe as a first meal, but just before they get milk. The center should really be on putting back on milk, and we should start giving them small milk meals. And those calves, it is true that they have some degree of metabolic acidosis, not as severe as diarrheic calves, but we know that they will develop metabolic acidosis. So I think there is room for electrolyte, but we shouldn't feed the electrolyte and then wait the next day to give milk. That cannot be.
Yeah, and this is my own question because you mentioned getting them back off milk. What's your opinion about withdrawing milk and replacing it by electrolytes when calves have any type of trouble?
I would never do that, because we see, for example, in the context of diarrhea, that even if the calf has diarrhea, but as long as they stay on milk, they can go through it. But it's really when they stop drinking milk that they will collapse, that they will have severe dehydration, that metabolic acidosis will really build up. So it's very important to always keep them on milk. And of course, the milk cannot be drenched. So I would never replace a milk meal by an electrolyte, but the electrolyte can be used in a supportive way in different types of conditions. And in any, for transported calves, for calves that are sick from disease or diarrhea, I would never give hypertonic electrolytes. It should always be hypotonic. The question is then how much sodium, how high should be the alkalinizing capacity.
Okay. One that Jean-Baptiste, I think, is going to enjoy. Classic question when it comes to talking about milk fever, alkalosis, acidosis, and the sensitivity to PTH. We've always understood cows that are alkalotic cannot regulate their calcium needs because of PTH responsiveness, but this is not how you explain it today.
Indeed, yes. More and more there has been data coming out also of Germany. Mirja Wilkens from Leipzig has been instrumental in bringing into light, but also those older study from the sheep that I show clearly illustrate the impact of metabolic acidosis in altering the functionality of a key player in calcium homeostasis in the kidney. So the protein that is there to make sure that calcium is not escaping into urine is functionally altered under metabolic acidosis. So it's it's not like we are restoring a normality when we bring to acidosis. It's actually an abnormality, and I think this is important to remind, because we see that extended application of acidosis may have risk in the subsequent lactation, but this artificially creates an additional calcium demand, which stimulates calcium absorption efficiency to go up from the gut. And therefore, when calcium demand at calving increase, those cattle that have been fed anionic salt are better able to cope with that sudden increase, because calcium absorption efficiency in the gut is higher. So that's really the most documented and well-established mechanism of anionic salt.
And one last before we wrap up, because we are a little bit of a time, but I cannot help myself from asking, in these two situations that you have discussed, pulling out the needle and trying to correct the problem, IV infusions exist for both calving cows and diarrheic calves. So this is a question for the two of you. What are your views on suitability or disadvantages of intravenous infusions? Who wants to start?
Can let Jean-Baptiste start?
Okay. Well, I think it's very risky, at least, to have this as a standard baseline strategy, because it actually probably induces the wrong type of adaptation, because we give a sudden signals of calcium abundance, while the cow should really be working on upregulating calcium absorption. But if this signals is sent abruptly with an IV, then we send a signal that perhaps we need to slow down those adaptation, and then we pay the price a day later, because actually calcemia is lower than if we had done nothing. Now, for sure, in some circumstances, this is absolutely fantastic that we can infuse calcium in blood, and this has been life-saving in individual cows scenario. So I would really strictly reserve this type of application for cows that do show strong sign of milk fever with the cold ears, and reserve this to those cows.
Okay. Juliet, I see you're frozen, at least in my screen.
Oh, can you hear me?
But, yeah, I can hear you.
So in the case of diarrheic calves, it's a bit different, because intravenous solution will always be life-saving if there is a proper protocol in place. The problem is the availability and the skill, and also to have the right protocol on farm. And that's why providing electrolyte at the early stage of the diarrhea will prevent the need of intravenous solution for calves.
Okay, and I think we are over time. It's an interesting topic, at least to me, obviously. I want to thank everyone for having joined. I've seen up to 80 people connected at peak, and I hope to see you again at the upcoming webinars of this series, and have a great day. Bye-bye.